Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Gillian O'Brien. I'm the manager of Wild Sexual Violence Prevention Association in Brisbane. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Thank you. I'm Katie. I'm one of the project workers at Wild.
Hi, I'm Christy. I got disability and I used to be part of Wild. Now I'm a paid worker at Wild. I'm working with Katie.
Thank you, Katie and Christy. So we're here to deliver some training, which is an accompaniment to the handbook on supporting people with intellectual disability who have experienced domestic and family violence. So the handbook was a project between People with Disabilities Australia, based in New South Wales, and ourselves, Wild Sexual Violence Prevention Association, based in Queensland. It was targeted at the New South Wales sexual, domestic and family violence sectors in response to requests from New South Wales Women's Alliance and the domestic and family violence sector on more information around working with women with intellectual disability who have experienced domestic violence. There was funding from the New South Wales Government, Communities and Justice, the Building Access Project, and from Women New South Wales to develop this project. The handbook itself was developed quite quickly, but was based on a resource that Wild developed about 12 years ago, around that too, called How to Hear Me. And How to Hear Me was a resource kit for counsellors working with people with intellectual and learning disabilities who have experienced trauma. So we took this information and added further information, particularly focused around domestic and family violence, which is a big area of our work in the interceding years, and try to adapt it to be useful for the sector. So we'll be wanting to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the filming of this training is taking place. So we're based in Brisbane and Mianjin, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people. So we pay our respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge the important role that First Nations people continue to play within our community. We'd also like, of course, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in New South Wales, where you may be watching from today. We'd like to acknowledge those participating today and all the collective wisdom in our collective spaces. So the training is just a quick taster for the more broad information that's covered in the handbook. So we'll cover definitions of intellectual disability, the intersection of intellectual disability and domestic and family violence. The voices of people who have intellectual disability will be throughout the booklet, including the wonderful Christy. And we'll talk about identifying intellectual disability, some of the issues that may come up for people who have intellectual disability in terms of communication and cognition, some tips for workers in how they can communicate more effectively, and tips for forming risk assessments and safety planning when working with someone with intellectual disability. So, how do we define disability? There's so many ways, of course. You've probably heard about the social model of disability. So this is from People with Disability Australia. This emphasises that disability results from disabling environmental and social barriers. Physical, attitudinal and communication barriers reduce the opportunities afforded to people with impairments, resulting in unequal access, exclusion and or discrimination. So the social model of disability highlights that it's a shared responsibility to ensure equality of access for all by addressing barriers to inclusion and full participation for people with disability. So this is why we're here today. This is why this resource has been created, because we need to look at the barriers that are within our own service systems and think about the ways that we can try and address those barriers. So that is, the social model is a different way of looking from the medical model. Traditionally, the medical model of defining intellectual disability is really focused on the person themselves, and it's quite a deficit model. There has been a big focus on IQ and like intellectual functioning, but the last DSM-5 had a much higher focused on adaptive functioning. So looking at people's conceptual skills, their social skills, their practical skills, and how they interact with someone's intellect and their cognitive functioning, and how they work together to define that person, how that person experiences intellectual impairment. So some of those, we've got a whole lot of skills there that you can see. So the conceptual skills we're talking about difficulties with language. A lot of people will define their disabilities having trouble reading and writing. Some people might have difficulties with money. Sequencing can be something that's a little bit more subtle to pick up on. And when you're working with someone who's trying to tell you about something that's happened to them, it might be hard to put it into a clear narrative or sequence of events. Issues with time. I know a lot of people who might turn up 2 hours early to an appointment because they weren't quite sure of the time. Then when they have those adaptive strategies to get there on time, but they have a bit of trouble, or someone might refer to something that happened last week which was something that happened years ago. So some people struggle with concepts of time and how to describe those and how they work. Some people may have issues with reasoning, just general knowledge and facts in the community. Some people have issues with memory, and planning is a big issue, and that'll definitely have to come into consideration when you're doing a safety planning. Giving a lot more support for people to plan the steps and to access your service. Issues with problem solving, being quite literal thinkers. Some people can be quite literal in how they interpret something. So being important to be on the same page and careful how you use language and an idiom to describe something that might not be on the same page on that. Humour and sarcasm. Everyone I work with, most people I work with have a great sense of humour. Hey, Christy?
Yeah.
You certainly do.
All the time, every day.
Yeah, Christy will probably show that through this presentation at times. But I guess some people might struggle with sarcasm and understanding a double meaning of words, or just having a different sense of humour than you might be used to. So using that as a great communication and rapport building tool, but being aware about how that's working for that individual person. Difficulties with abstract thinking. We'll talk about a lot of these more about in the communication section of the presentation, but that's something a lot of people struggle with. And generalizing learning from one situation to another. You can see in the social skills section, we've got empathy. A lot of people are really empathetic, but other people can struggle with that. Reading social situations and cues, which can be quite risky if you have to struggle with those things. Interpersonal communication skills, ability to make and retain friendships, which can put a lot of people at risk if they're socially isolated. So being suggestible, having just people saying yes, compliance, because they might not understand the question, or because they're talking with someone they consider be in a more powerful position than they are. So they'll just agree because they don't want to get in trouble for various reasons. And masking is another social issue. A lot of people will pretend that they don't have a disability or pretend that they understand something. And then there's those practical skills like personal care. Some people have some struggles with travel skills, personal safety, use of money. Some people will be pay for things most of the time with a large note when they've got their pension, because they know that they will that will be enough money to pay for something, and then hope they get the right change left back. So that can be tricky, managing those things for some people. Schedules and routines, use of the phone. A lot of old people using smartphones. And when I started this 10 years ago, and getting on the texting and Facebook, which is great. But yep, some people still struggle with those things, and they might use them in different ways. And occupational skills.
So, how does this all interact with rates of violence? I think some of the statistics around this are quite alarming. So women with physical and cognitive disability experience high rates of DV, than those without disabilities. And those with cognitive disabilities, so intellectual disabilities and learning disabilities, are even higher risk. For 15.9% of women with disability or long-term health condition reported experience of violence in the last 12 months, compared to just 4.3% of women without disability. And that likelihood of experience abuse is likely to increase as the severity of that person's disability does. And this is probably one of the worst ones down the bottom, is that 90% of women with intellectual disability will experience abuse over their lifetime. I do want to kind of frame these that obviously this isn't something particular to intellectual disability. A lot of the drivers of violence in this space are experiences of sexism and ableism, and these sexist and ableist beliefs that we hold in society, which means it's more likely that people experience violence over their lifetime. So when we're talking about domestic violence, people with intellectual disability definitely do experience many of the forms that you'd be familiar with and that most people experience, but there is kind of particular types of abuse that people with intellectual disabilities might specifically experience. A lot of this is to do with relationships in life, so they might be more likely to experience abuse from caregivers or carers and professionals in this field as well as the likelihood of experiencing abuse from people within group homes or shared accommodation, which is often not covered by our definitions of domestic violence. Many people experience sexual abuse, so that can be in exchange for care, things like that. Reproductive abuse, there's a long history of the sterilisation of women with intellectual disability, and that can still happen today in various forms. And that can be based on, a lot of these are based on stereotypes or assumptions people make as well about people with intellectual disability, that is sometimes the best option for the person when it's not. Forced social isolation. So people with intellectual disability are largely excluded and often socially isolated. And that can be exacerbated in the experience of abuse. So the person using violence can really play on that and make that a lot worse. And we also see physical abuse in the form of withholding disability-related equipment. So a lot of people with intellectual disability might have other disabilities, so things like wheelchairs not being charged, hearing aids taken away, things like that, as well as withholding things like medication that they use, or misusing restraints, or heating a bath too hot during an act of care. And financial abuse. So I think this again is really tied into some of those assumptions people make about people with intellectual disability. So the idea that people with intellectual disability can't manage their own money, or they can't be in charge of their finance, and this can be really misused by the person using violence as an excuse to control their finances or limit their control in that area. So we've got here the power and control wheel. So this is in the handbook, and it's a little bit tricky to read probably from the screen, but if you want to have a better look at that, that kind of goes into more detail about some of those caregiver dynamics when there's abuse from a caregiver. Okay, so what do workers need to know about people who have an intellectual disability?
Mainly the workers need to know, especially ask them what type disability have you got, and what can you do or can't do, or see what they can do to help us with things.
So we talked about this a lot, hey Christy, about how one of the kind of common myths that people believe is that people with intellectual disability are all the same. So kind of like what you're saying, that everyone's different, they need different things.
Everyone's different.
Yeah.
We all don't have the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some other quotes here from other people with intellectual disability. So the first one there says, people need to know that people who have a disability take a lot longer to process things. People who have a disability don't get it straight away. I know that's something you talk about a lot as well, Christy, this idea that just because it takes a bit longer doesn't mean you can't do it.
No, give us time and we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one down there that I think is a great quote is, understand that people with disability will blame themselves straight up. The perpetrator will tell them this. 9 times out of 10, people with disability will believe them because they've been bullied every day of their life. And I know that you've spoken about that a lot too, that sometimes people using violence will play into some of these common assumptions or myths in society, and that will make it harder for people.
Yeah, because they know it'd be easier to get to us because we've got disability.
Yeah, and you've had those negative experiences before. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to add there, Christy?
No.
No, good for you. So we'll just bring up a little video. So this was actually from a project, one of the projects I was working on, and Christy was a part of this project as well. And this is where we were talking about, it's based on a podcast that we did called The And You Think You're the Expert, where people with ID interviewed workers about the accessible practice. But this particular video is about how to identify intellectual disability. So we'll just bring that up now.
Hi, my name's Alison and I'm a peer worker at Wild. We made a podcast about what workers can do to help women. Women with intellectual disabilities going through violence, like domestic violence or sexual violence. This video, we're going to talk to experts from the podcast, women with intellectual disability. We're going to ask them about how workers can work out who has a disability. Let's ask some questions.
How do you describe your disability?
With have a learning, not understanding as well as others do, and take a bit of time to get help with different things.
I have an intellectual disability because sometimes it's hard to understand, like doing homework with the boys, things like that.
I've got a slow learner and I can't read and do spelling and add up like maths. And I had to tell the worker I got a slow learner disability. Don't be afraid to tell anyone and listen to them. I'm a slow learner. Sometimes I ask questions, and that's a part of my disability. I ask questions if I don't understand something. Having trouble learning to spell words.
I struggle with everyday life, with real bad depression, anxiety.
That's how I describe my disability.
Why is it hard to tell workers you have a disability?
It's very hard to tell workers because they just pick on you and be mean to you, and they think you can't do things, but that's not true. It's because people tease you if they know that you've got a disability.
Because of discrimination, people tend to judge you.
I had a little bit of trouble on saying things what I want to say to them. I feel like embarrassed by my disability sometimes. Sometimes I hide it by big words.
What could workers do to make you feel comfortable to talk about your disability?
Really listening to you and not being judgmental.
Let us know it's okay to speak up and that they won't judge us.
sit down with me, have a cuppa. People can listen to us and hear us. We got disability.
They could just be polite and talk to you and ask them, are you okay? Can you explain what's your disability? And yeah.
Maybe they might have a background story of themselves or loved one that they might know. Just making sure that they have that connection and understanding.
Just be with us, spend time with us, talk to us, chat with us. We're one of them. We'll get on.
I just want them to get to know me.
How would you like people to treat you?
I'd like to be treated with respect and to be heard. I want people to treat you as respect.
With respect.
With respect.
With respect. It's important for anyone, like with respect, and I would do the same with them.
Like a normal person, don't look at people like they got disability. People need to treat us the same as like whoever doesn't have an intellectual disability, because everyone who has an intellectual disability or who hasn't got an intellectual disability are all the same people, and they like have to be respected.
Like a person, like just like everyone else in the world.
My advice is just be with them. We're all normal. We're all human.
Okay, if you want to see more of that, feel free to jump on to the And You Think You're the Expert website. We've got some more videos and all the podcast episodes there as well.
Very nice plug.
I have to.
Well done. Yeah. Okay. So, and a lot of the, the quotes that we've got in this training and throughout the handbook have been from consultations with women with intellectual disability that were from that project. So, yes, highly encourage you to have a look at that as well. So we'll go into talking about identifying intellectual disability. So it can be, there is a vast range in how people with intellectual disability present. And some people it might be easier to identify than others. But there's a lot of people out there who, from a quick conversation, people might not pick up with that someone has intellectual disability. As you saw in the video, that people don't always want to say that they have a disability. They haven't necessarily had a good response in the past when they've shared that information. So thank you, Karen. So they might not identify as having a disability themselves. They might not say think that applies to them. So they might have different ways of describing that they have a disability, like I'll call it a learning disability, or just say I have troubles with forms or reading or writing, whatever that looks like. A lot of people are quite good at hiding their disability. They haven't had they've had to get on in life. They haven't had a good experience with people knowing that they had a disability in the past because of the ableist society we live in. So they can be quite adept at masking, quite good at masking.
Did you want to share how you explain your disability, Christy?
Yeah, like with my disability, I got brain damage since I was a baby. And there's all different types of disability. Like just me, I can hide my non-verbal tell.
Mm-hmm.
Less I tell use.
Yeah, that's right. Might not pick it up quickly, eh?
No.
Mm. So some of the things when you're talking to someone that you might start to pick up on are that some questions that you ask people might have a bit of difficulty coming up with an answer or explaining themselves and explaining things. They might have a bit of difficulty in making themselves understood when they're trying to explain something. Might have problems with following a lot when there are multiple instructions or requirements. There might be difficulties with following social norms, or may have different ways of describing things, unconventional expression. than what you might expect. A gap between words and action. So I might say that, oh yeah, I understand that, but they're not actually follow through on that. I feel like that could be two things. That might be not understanding what has been asked of them, or it might be just, I'm just going to say yes, and then because I want to get out of here and do what I want. So they might sometimes present as being a bit younger or possibly older than their actual age. They may have difficulties in problem solving or trying to identify priorities. So I think that's really relevant when you're trying to risk assess with someone, because they might not have the same idea of what should be the priority of the conversation as you do. I think can be something to be really aware of, and because you might need to ask quite specific questions to get to something that's really important that's happened for them, but they haven't thought to tell you straight away. Some people may have difficulties with concentration and be a bit distractible and get off topic and go other ways. So there's just some possible indicators that someone might have intellectual disability. There's lots of people out there who have never had a formal diagnosis or assessment. We've known people who've been diagnosed in adulthood. They've gone all through school and it hasn't been picked up. So particularly, older people. So a lot of people haven't got necessarily paperwork to prove that they have a disability or to say what that is. Some people might have really strong verbal skills and speak really well and present really well, but they might have, mask that difficulty with understanding concepts quite well. And there's these issues with intellectual disability and sometimes trauma, how trauma affects people. They might present in similar ways, like trouble with memory and retaining information, focus, sequencing, having high levels of anxiety. Some of those things might be both going on for a person, or it might be two different things that might be having that impact. Some of the social indicators someone might have a disability is that they receive a disability pension, DSP. They might have attended a special school, or they might have been in a special class at school, while other people might have just gotten through school without having any extra attention. But not necessarily done that, had great results. Some people work in an Australian disability enterprise or might be in a work training program. They might attend some kind of respite or activity group during the day. They might be involved with multiple service systems. So some people will have support staff and hours during the week, have NDIS. Other people won't have any of that and have never had those formal supports, but they might end up at times interacting with a lot of different service systems because they haven't got the support that they need to get on safely. And some people live in supported accommodation, but others live in independently. And some have, their kids in their care, and like the lady in the video was talking about helping her boys with homework and might be parenting full-time or part-time. So what are the signs that when you're talking to someone, what does it sound like? What are things to listen out for? Having a short attention span, being easily distracted. Some people might have trouble absorbing and recalling information. Responses might be delayed. So when you say something, some people might take a while to respond. So they need to take that information in, they have to process it, think about what the answer is, and then formulate the words to respond. Some people take longer with that than others. Difficulty with problem solving, sequencing, speech and verbal issues. So some people have a bit of a speech impairment, others don't. Have trouble understanding questions, and you might notice compliance. You might have people nodding along or agreeing with you when that might not be what they actually want. Having difficulty articulating feelings. Feelings are quite abstract, so that can be something people have trouble with. Being vulnerable to suggestibility. They might be likely to have trouble elaborating and talking in detail about the topics that you're talking about. We talked about having concrete or literal thinkers and having trouble with abstract thought. It might not identifying as having a disability. Yeah, we've done most of those. Trouble with complex tasks, become frustrated easily. So sometimes those responses people have that, when people get frustrated, they don't understand, or they're feeling looked down on or not understood, those can come out in different ways, an expression of frustration. So some of those gentle questions that you can start to ask if you think someone might have a disability. Some people out there, Christy, hey, they're okay if you just ask them straight out. And if you do have that in your intake processes, just as a question that you ask at everyone, that can sometimes elicit that information and make it easier for someone to just say, oh, yeah, I do have a disability, and explore that a little bit more. But if they haven't otherwise said, you can ask, do they have any other services involved or other workers that they work with, and what kind of things do they help with? Asking someone to explain back things in their own words can give you a bit of an understanding of how they're understanding what you've been talking about. Do you get a payment from Centrelink? Can you tell me if you get a payment from Centrelink? What's that for? And who do you talk to when you need help? So for those people who don't have any formal supports, there might be informal family members, neighbours, friends. Sometimes it's the partner who they have to rely on when they're needing assistance. And looking for people's whole responses and actions. So those non-verbal cues are so important when you're working with someone with intellectual disability. You won't necessarily get a clear indication based on what they say as to if they're understanding, what they're trying to communicate.
So communication tips. Now, I think it's worth stating here that like Chrissy said at the beginning, everyone's really different. So it's going to change a lot depending person to person, what they're finding tricky and what they find easier. But what would be some of your communication tips? So what helps workers make sense when they're talking? What kind of things should they be doing?
Using easy words or asking us to make sure we understand them, or they can pretty much show us similar like a video or draw a picture, so we understand what they're talking about.
Yeah, so using lots of different methods, so not just talking, using diagrams, pictures, videos, and trying to use easy words.
Yeah, easy words, and gives time to sink it in, and so we know what to say back.
Yeah, a big tip from the groups we did was really taking your time and letting people absorb the information. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a couple of other quotes here from other women we've consulted with. So one of them says, going to the centre was so scary. I'd never been there before, so it was hard to listen. And I think this was a really common theme where a lot of people said when they were feeling anxious, it was really hard to take in new information. And the last one there, it makes me feel stupid when they say big things I don't understand. So people can also shut down because it can feel shameful not understanding what someone's going on about. Building rapport. So we've talked a lot about this, because you've been a big promoter of how important it is when you have a good relationship with a worker, hey?
Yes.
Did you want to talk a little bit about that? Why is it so important?
It's because it's so important to take time with us, spend time with us, because the way we've been, and we have been treated wrong before, so it's going to take us a little while for us to trust you. If you take your time with us, we'll trust you. We'll just take time.
Yeah, so a lot of people in the projects I've been doing talked about how they thought a lot of people in the community and workers believed a lot of the really harmful myths about intellectual disability, or people had also had really bad experiences where they'd been discriminated against, and it made them wary about new relationships.
That's why they need to be patient with us.
So a lot of people said that it took a lot of time to build trust, hey?
Yeah, it does. It takes a long time because you don't know if we can trust them at first, because you don't know if they're going to go around saying stuff about you. We've got to trust them first, see what they're like.
So a strong relationship not only means that you have a better idea of what that person's personalized communication is, so the particular things they find hard and the particular things they find easier, so you can personalize what you're saying to their understanding and the way they like to communicate. But it also means the person feels safe enough that they can hear what you're saying. Because sometimes you're not saying things in a bad way, it's just the person's feeling overwhelmed and they can't take it in. I think one of the most important thing here is always taking responsibility for misunderstanding. So this is a lovely quote from one of our counsellors at Wild, and she said, it's not the client's job to understand, it's our job to make it understandable.
And plus, when you go to them, you don't want to talk about it straight away.
Yeah, so you might need, that's another good point. So a lot of people said that you don't want to jump into the nitty gritty, I think they said, until you've had a moment of pause so they can get to know you, get to know what you like, get to know the service. And I think a big recommendation was have a cup of tea.
Yes, a cup of tea.
Or coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee and snacks.
Snacks as well.
What do you think people will do if they are feeling like overwhelmed, if it's getting, there's a lot of intense questioning quite quickly?
Give us bit of space or stop asking them questions at the moment and go to talk about something else, then go back to that question. Or if we're not ready, wait till we're ready.
Yeah. Take more time to be ready.
Yeah.
So some more communication tips. I think we've already covered this, Christy. You've done a beautiful job already. But using those easy words, taking more time, discussing things one at a time, and in different ways. So like you were saying, trying some different methods if what you're doing is not working. Signpost to change a conversation. So this one's really handy, particularly for things like safety planning. So I know in DV work, you'll often have a lot of different things you need to cover in a short amount of time. So it can be important to make sure you're signposting that. So saying, we're going to talk about 3 things today, A, B, and C. Let's start talking about A. And then, okay, we've finished with A. Now we're going to talk about B. So really making those conversation changes really clear. Asking one question at a time, so not overloading with questions like I was doing to you earlier, and keeping it to one choice or idea per question. Like Christy was saying, giving time to process. As Dylan was saying before, a lot of people say yes when they really mean no, or they didn't understand the question because they feel like they have to say yes. So wherever possible, using open-ended questions so that people can give a full reply rather than just saying yes or no, and letting people tell their story in their own way. So that might be jumping forward and back, but it allows them to tell it in a way they feel comfortable and it makes sense to them. So checking for understanding is really important throughout. So I know this is a big thing that you talk about, is check the person's on the same page with you. So here's a couple of tips around that, and there's more in the handbook, but could you tell me in your own words? So clarifying, breaking down complex ideas. So this might be particularly good for things that require steps like safety planning. What's the first thing you need to do? What's the step after that? Naming and concretizing alternatives. So we could do X or we could do Y. Either is fine. What would you like to do? So really naming all the options that are available. And the naive questioner. So I don't know much about X. Could you tell me about it? So letting people explain something in their own way. So wherever possible, not asking too many questions at once, not putting too many options into the one question. So how do you feel about going out today and going in the taxi? Asking about those 2 things separately. Not using jargon, which is incredibly difficult as a social worker myself, and limiting abstract concepts. So keeping it really concrete examples.
Okay, so we've talked quite a few times about abstract versus concrete and what that means, that some people, a lot of people with intellectual disability will struggle with abstract concepts. So for most people that develops in like when they're early teenager, start developing, finding those things easier and easier to understand, things that are of the mind rather than things that are of the world. So things that we can touch, that we can feel, concrete concepts and ideas, things that we understand abstractly, like things we can attribute multiple meanings to, symbols, feelings, concepts like justice and risk. All of those things are abstract concepts. So some people will have, people will know like certain abstract concepts that they've had lots of opportunities to learn and to have experience of. They might know what love is because they've seen lots of, had experiences themselves, or seen lots of movies where they show what love looks like and how it feels. But understanding more complex abstract concepts, and that's what a lot of those big words that we use are, when those hard words are abstract concepts. So abstract thinking enables a person to be able to apply learning from one situation to another. So you've safety planned in this situation. What does that look like in this situation? That might be easier to learn, or in this relationship, and then seeing those same things in another language, another relationship, those same red flags or whatever, might be harder for someone who has intellectual disability. Ability to analyze a situation, problem solve, reflect on the significance of something that's happened in their life, interpret and to apply logic and reasoning, enabling an understanding of consequences. So that's going to be, for some people, that's going to be quite tricky. And yeah, for most people under some of the Piaget theory, developmental theory, it's developed by around the age of 12 for most people. But as we've said, for people with intellectual disability, it develops a bit differently. So for concrete thinkers, it's processing information literally based on here and now. So a concrete thinker, for a very culturally specific example, will look at the Statue of Liberty in America and see a woman holding a torch, and an abstract thinker might understand it as a symbol of freedom and all of the things surrounding that.
Okay, so clearly some of those things will impact on how you perform a risk assessment with someone. So risk assessments by their nature is trying to predict future risk to that person. So a lot of that's really tricky when someone struggles with abstract thought, because it's quite an abstract idea to predict what someone's going to do in the future based on their previous actions. Like we said before, a lot of the communication during risk assessment is really personalized to that person. So as Gillian mentioned, a lot of people will have particular understandings of things they've come across a lot or had the opportunity to engage in. So it's not to assume that everyone will find this tricky or that everyone won't be able to do this. We've got a couple of common examples of wording and how some of the wording might be challenging. I'm sure that many of you don't use, have you experienced financial abuse, that you use a lot of these smaller sentences already. But just really making sure that you're breaking down ideas into smaller chunks and you're checking with people around their understanding of how the concepts you're using. So a good check-in is, what's your understanding of a particular abstract concept? What's your understanding? And then going from there to have a look at how that plays out for that person. So like we mentioned before, people might not necessarily present with what you kind of assess as the most pressing issue. For example, I've worked at a DV service before, and someone called up and they were talking a lot about their partner stealing the remote control. And after a lot further discussion, a lot of toing and froing, we kind of worked out that she'd actually been choked and that she really needed urgent medical attention. But for her, that wasn't the most pressing thing that she was presenting with that day. She was really distressed about the remote. So people might need quite direct questions to get at what's going on. There's also issues around here and now safety. So people might not necessarily be able to say, if you asked, are you safe right now? They might say yes, because they're with a worker. or they're away, or they're with someone else, but if they were to return home, they'd be very unsafe. So just being quite particular and careful about your questioning to double check that the meaning that you're hoping to send across is actually the meaning they're receiving. So I've kind of already talked about that one. So we do have a resource available called You Deserve to Be Safe. And it's an easy read, so it's got pictures as well as simple language. So that could be a good start if you're looking for other ways to word things or explain things. And like Christy said before, sometimes having another resource to go through with someone can be a good way to change how you're communicating and trying different methods with them.
In the handbook, there's a number of other resources that we refer to as well, like the Sunny app that's developed by What I Hate Respect has really great simple definitions of all the different forms of violence that people might experience, and is developed in consultation with people with disability. There's a number of other ones there.
So safety planning. Given that a lot of people with intellectual disabilities struggle with planning, safety planning can be quite a tricky concept. It's important to really explain what safety planning is, what the purpose is, what the outcome you hope for is. It's also important to check in and don't assume the person is going to keep that private. So being really explicit about the need to keep that to themselves or only to safe people, and helping them talk through that. Like Jillian said before, sometimes people really struggle to imagine the consequences of actions they take. So really having explicit conversations of, if you tell the other party, it sounds like based on what you said that they might hurt you in the way that you described before. I'm worried that if you tell such and such that you're going to be hurt again. What do you think of that? So really being quite explicit with your concerns. In the safety plan, make sure you're considering any communication, mobility issues, care requirements that person has. So even, if part of it is calling emergency refuge services, things like that, talking about how they might communicate on the phone, what kind of things would be important to bring up on the phone call, those kind of things. So being quite detailed in your preparation. But obviously, another part is memory. So a lot of people are not going to remember the ins and outs of everything you discussed. It might need to be repeated many, many times. So that can be something to reinforce with the person, either writing it down if it's safe to do so, but getting them to call up if they're getting stuck, or telling other safe supports so that they have other people in their life to help reinforce that plan. And consider having different safety plans for different contexts. So again, people may struggle taking one safety plan and applying it to another one. So if they have a safety plan for their house, they might struggle to apply that plan if they were to go see the person using violence at the shops. So making sure that you have plans for a range of environments they might see the person. So this is really just acknowledgement that a lot of people with intellectual disabilities have multiple people in their lives who are providing different types of support. So they might have their disability service provider, yourself, their support coordinator, their public guardian, their family members. They also may have none of these, but it's important to consider sharing your information and your knowledge about the risk assessment, particularly with service providers who specialize in disability. So that can be really useful to make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone has the same risk assessment, and everyone has the same safety plan they can help reinforce. Of course, if the person consents to this and this is something that they'd like. That was strong feedback in the groups that we did, that a lot of people said it's really hard to remember, and that if they're consenting, it's really helpful to have other people who have that knowledge and plan with them.
Yeah, and acknowledging the the areas of expertise of the other groups and maybe gaps in knowledge as well, like being really clear about the risk profile and what's okay and what's not okay for services to, especially where like a family member might be the person using violence. That can get complex and how you go about, or public guardian wanting to do an investigation, what's actually happening there and what's okay to do and what's not okay. Yes, that they won't place the person at greater risk. So when someone wants to report an incident of violence to police, there are special witness provisions that are available in New South Wales. A person with an impairment, cognitive impairment, may be entitled to supports, such as a support person being present during the interview. They may be classed as a special witness, and the recorded interview. So this is something we really advocate for up here when we're supporting people to go to police, is to have a special recorded interview with a specially trained police officer, and so their statement is recorded rather than written. So the police are trained that they can ask questions in non-leading ways, then open-ended questions. So they're not likely to influence the person or could get the person confused in saying yes to something because they didn't ask, didn't understand the question. That interview then can be used as their evidence in chief if it goes to a court proceeding. So they're not having to then tell the whole story again in a court setting. That video recording statement is used instead, and then they still need to be cross-examined. We do find that there's often confusion for police when someone might qualify and it might be appropriate to do this video recorded interview, and it may require advocacy, especially where someone might present well and not have, it might not be immediately obvious that they have a disability. Police might just want to do a written statement because that might be seem easier at the time. Whether that actually goes that well once it gets started is another question. And also, if the person has done a written statement before, they may be wanting to do a written statement again because they've done it before. But the research evidence does say that for people with a cognitive impairment, that video recorded statement with that specialist process for questioning is the safest way of getting a good evidence from someone with intellectual impairment. Similar kind of processes that they use for children as well. And if there are arguments from police, they can go back and, once it gets to court, if they're concerned about it being rejected from court, it can be written out, the transcript from the statement. It doesn't, the video statement. That's not a reason they should be doing it. And this is we got that from QPS, from Queensland Police Service, but I'm sure the same would apply in New South Wales as well. But yeah, we're aware there's similar processes in New South Wales. So to give a bit of an overview of accessibility in practice, really great resource and report that I'd refer you to is the ANRO's Whatever It Takes report, which is about accessibility for domestic and family violence and services, and for people with all kinds of disabilities, not just intellectual disability. The 4 A's that describe that the services are approachable, so people know the service is there, that they can find it, they can get to it, they feel okay about going there. That they're acceptable and appropriate, so it's a good fit for the person. They get to say if it feels like working for them, that it's working for them. So they feel okay to speak up if something, if they don't understand something, they feel they can have a good rapport with the worker and be able to discuss, what the service and what their needs are. That it should be affordable. It shouldn't cost you money to get there. Like transport can be a big issue for people with intellectual impairment, and to be there and to go as often as you need to. The services should be available and it's there for you. You can use it like other people who don't have a disability do. So I'd encourage you to have a look at it, and we've got a bit more accessibility and practice in the handbook. And we've got a couple of quotes from Women with Disability. Do you want to read those, Katie?
Yeah, so I suppose just to end on another note, because I know it's been a lot of doom and gloom, but I think we see a lot of people at Wild who've recovered from their experiences of violence and have become massive advocates in this space. And people do and can get through this. And so we've got some quotes here saying, "I do have a disability. I don't let it control my life. I try to read letters and texts the best I can. If you let it rule your life, it can take over you. I try to do things on my own. You rule it. My mum and dad thought I'd never be able to have kids, but I have 3 beautiful kids. And I've been sexually assaulted. I've had domestic violence. It changes you. I'm not the same. If someone pushes me down, I get back up. No one pushes me around anymore. I know that you had some things you wanted to say here too, Christy, about getting through hard things like this.
Yeah, like get help. There's people that they want to help you. Like Hunter Claus, you've got through domestic violence and you've got disability. It doesn't mean you can get through this, because you can.
Yeah, and that's kind of why you do this work, hey?
Yeah, because I've been there and I've done that, and I know what others going through. That's why I'm here to help them, because we can communicate more better between us, because we understand each other, what we've been through.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll have a closer look at the handbook on supporting people with intellectual disability who've experienced domestic and family violence. We've just put our contact details up there if you do want to get in touch. Obviously, we're a Queensland-based service, but we're happy to have a chat anytime. And yeah, some references there on the presentation today. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to PWDA, New South Wales, and Women's Alliance, and all the other associated partners. Thank you.